Well, from what everybody tells me, there was an incredible enthusiasm. How could there not be? I mean, here was a country that was pretty developed by Latin American standards in 1959, but who was living in a dictatorship. Batista was a strongman, the rich were very rich, and there were pockets of misery, although you had a very big middle class in Cuba. So for a lot of Cubans, well-meaning Cubans, here came a guy who promised democracy, who promised to help the poor, and a lot of people, intellectuals, professionals, middle-class people, felt rightly that it was a real embarrassment for this reasonably, wealthy country to have so many poor. So they backed Fidel Castro. Even some of the people who are mostly against him today backed Fidel Castro, and probably rightly so. Well, some people will remember him as a well-meaning revolutionary who raised this country's health and education standards and did a lot of good for the poor, people who were never taken care of by the previous governments. And others will obviously see him as this ruthless tyrant who suppressed, fundamental freedoms for 50 years and clung to power by the most undemocratic means. In the end, history has a way to co-opt former strongman. I wouldn't be surprised if 10, 20 years after Fidel Castro's death, you have a Castrista party in Cuba that is pro-US. It happens all the time in Latin America. Parties tend to use the names of former dictators or former strongmen and then do whatever they like with it. There's always a big discussion on whether Cuba is moving backwards or forwards, whether the country's better off than it used to be 50 years ago. The joke I heard in Cuba when I was going pretty often to the island was the three great things about the Cuban Revolution: health, education, and maintaining the national sovereignty. And the three bad things about the Cuban Revolution are breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And there's something to it. Cuba has undoubtedly done pretty well in health and education, although a lot of people will tell you that it used to be already in 1959 one of the most advanced countries in Latin America in health and education and many other social aspects. But today, it's a pretty poor, forgotten, sad place. Of course, there's a big discussion of whether we're going to see change disguised as continuity or continuity disguised as change. My bet is that we're going to see change disguised as continuity. And the reason is, I'm going to illustrate it with an example. One of the last times I went to Cuba, I was invited to a show, to an art exhibit. And they were exhibiting a lot of very critical stuff, like a painting of an island surrounded by barbed wire, stuff that was pretty critical of the Cuban Revolution. And I asked an artist at that art exhibit, how can you get away with this? And the artist told me, well, as long as you frame things in honor of the revolution or in honor of Fidel Castro, you can get away with anything. If we make a fast forward and look what's going to happen in Cuba from now on, I would bet you that as long as Fidel Castro is alive, you're going to see the same thing happening in Cuba. In other words, they're going to frame everything as if it was following the guidelines of Fidel Castro. But in reality, they're going to do whatever they want. And they have to change because they know, they are the first to know, that the Cuban Revolution has been a total disaster from an economic, human, political point of view, and that they have to change. The 50th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution comes at an incredible moment because Barack Obama, the President-elect of the United States, has promised, he told me in an interview and he said it publicly in a speech in Miami, that he would change Cuba policy. He was going to start allowing remittances to Cuba. He's going to start allowing travel to Cuba, which was reduced in 2004. So he's going to make more than symbolic changes, and that's going to put Cuba on the spot because the Cuban regime has been claiming for all these years that all the difficulties they have at home, lack of food, lack of freedoms, etc., it was either because of the U.S. embargo or because Cuba's need to defend itself from foreign aggression, etc. Now suddenly, if there's a president in the U.S. who openly says he wants to, come closer to Cuba and mend fences, what are they going to say?